This video looks at the design of a basic rectangle class in Java. We start with a rectangle that just has a height and a width, look at writing its accessors, mutators, private versus public, and then move on to constructors and other methods. So here we have the basic setup of a rectangle class. We've got two variables, height and width. And down below here, we're going to define different methods. This is where your accessor methods, your mutator methods, and other methods can go. Before we write accessor and mutator methods, I do want to talk about the access modifiers. We've talked about having public versus private. So instead of just having double height and double width like we see here, we can add the word private in front of these to make this more secure. So let's take a second to have a look and see how these access modifiers like private affect the access of these variables in a different class. So I'm going to just create a new class here, and I'm going to call it rectangle tester. I can call it whatever I want, right? But this is going to be my main method. So let me get public static void main here. And in this class, this is where I'm going to test my rectangle class with different things. So they're in the same folder so they can see each other, right? First of all, just to make sure we're all on the same page, how do I create a rectangle object? What's my syntax for this? Rectangle, I'll call it rect1, right? Equals new rectangle, right? Good? Okay. And then we know the syntax. Anytime I want to call methods, I would say things like rect1 dot and then whatever my method name is, right? Okay. So something that we have not talked about at this point is that for this rectangle class, these variables can actually be seen and modified outside of the class without these methods. So let me show you what I mean. I'm taking away the word private here, and we've just created a double height and width, right? So this is not good practice, but this can be done. So I want to show you why we care about the word private. I can say rect1 dot height, okay? And then maybe set it equal to something. I set it equal to 5. So I do want to compare and contrast this real quick. We've not seen anything like this. Height is not a method, right? It's an actual variable name. But since we could have multiple rectangle objects, we can access that variable directly. So like set the height to 5, right? But we have to tell it which rectangle object we're setting the height for. Now, this is not good practice. We don't really want people to be able to directly access my height and my width variables. And the reason is, what if someone using my class, right, was able to set the height to something like -22, right? That doesn't make sense. If we were creating a software that was going to do some things, that would probably break some function later on that we had written. Right? It does not make sense for height to be something like -22. But right now, we have no way to prevent them from doing that. So really what we want to do is as we design our code, we want to control access to different things. So this functions as usual, but hopefully this shows you why this is not good practice to have direct access to your attributes. Okay? Let me save these, and let me show you one thing. So if I go into my rectangle class, and I make this variable private, so I've just added the word private in front of my variable declaration, then watch what happens. I'm going to save this, and now, in this class, I haven't changed a thing, but it says the field rectangle.height is not visible. So now I'm not allowing them to access my height variable directly. Got me on that? So that's why things like private can be useful for us. We don't want them to be able to set our height to anything, right? Now, should we let users at some point specify what the height of their rectangle is? Sure, right? They're probably going to want to specify the height of their rectangle, but we want to control how they do it. We might want to make sure that it's within a certain range that makes sense. How do we let this user set the height of their rectangle, but on our terms? Setters and getters, right? Accessors and mutators. So I'm going to come down here, and in my methods, I'm going to write a method to set my height, right? Again, I could name this whatever I want, but this is the convention for a mutator. So again, this is a mutator method. So you guys tell me, you know how to write these. What is my syntax here? How do I write this? Public, void. Why void? Because it's not going to return anything to us. It's going to modify something but not return something. I'll name it set height. And what about my parameters? Do I need a parameter? I want the user to be able to set the height to something, right? Maybe they want to set the height to 5 or 110, right? But I want them to give me a height that they want to set their rectangle to, right? So yes, I want to get information from my user, so from an outside class, right, into this template. So the way that I denote that is I want to get a double from the user, and I'm going to call it HT, short for height. Yes?
If they were to put a negative number in for height now, what happens?
Let's watch what happens. So his question was, if they were to put a negative number in for height now, what happens? It's going to depend on how we write the code. So what we write in here is going to determine what happens. Okay? So let's say over here, so this is not good practice. I'm going to comment this out. So now, how would I set the height in this? So for rectangle 1, how would I set my height? Set height, rectangle 1 dot, set height, and then we can give it a height, right? I'm going to give it a height that makes sense, like 5. But before we can actually do this, right now, if we were to call this, the method set height is undefined for the type rectangle. It's because I didn't save it. Save it, that message goes away. But right now, if I were to call this set height method, does it correctly set the height to 5? No. So there's nothing special about this name set height or any of your method names. I have to write code in here that actually makes it do whatever I want it to do. So we want it to do what? We want it to take this height variable and set it to what they passed in. Follow me on that? So I'm going to say height equals, again, what they passed in is stored here in HT, so like this. Everybody with me so far? Okay, now let's back up. This variable is private, meaning that we cannot access it outside of this class. An important thing here, if I could underline this, I would be this class, right? So even though it's private, I can see it inside this class. I can see it and do things with it inside my rectangle class. So between these curly braces, I can modify height. With me? But I don't want someone else outside to do that. Now back to his original question. If I were to save this and run this at this point, does this set my height to 5 for my rectangle? Yeah. It passes in 5 here, right? Which we know when we store it here, it really looks like 5.0 because it passes it in, stores it in a double. Everybody with me on that? Yeah? And then is going to, so then this is 5.0, so height is 5.0. If I were to write a accessor really quick to get my height, then we could get it outside of here and print it and show you that it was 5.0. Let's go ahead and do that real quick just so we can play around and retrieve the height. So tell me how to write a height accessor. What does that look like? Public, double, because I want to return height, right? So double, get height. Do I need any more information from the user? No, they just want to say, hey, give me the height, right? And we give it back to them. So There's my method declaration. And then what do I want to do inside here? Return height. Okay, so now if I save this, go back to my tester class, I'm going to say system.out.println rect1.getHeight. With me? So when I run this code, what's going to print out? 5.0, right? We passed in 5, but since it was stored as a double, then when we get it back, it's going to return 5.0. And I ran it. Let's look at the console here. You can see 5.0 printed out. You with me so far? Yeah? You feeling okay about this stuff so far? Private's making a little more sense? Now, the only reason I was able to call these methods in this class is because I had the word public here. If I change this word, watch carefully, if I change this to private, save it, all of a sudden it says, I don't know what set height is. It can't see it, right? So that's the difference between public and private. Public are methods. Usually most of your methods are going to be public. And those are ones that people can use where you can help control access to your variables, okay? Anything that's private, they're not going to be able to see. So that's the reason. I know this whole time we've just been saying, write your methods, write the word public. We'll understand what it means later. Now we should understand what that means. Cool? Okay. So now let's save this so it fixes it back to public. And I'm going to pass in -22. Now you guys tell me what's going to happen when I pass in -22. We know what this code looks like, right? We just set height to what's passed in, then return height. So if I run this, what's going to print out? -22.0. So you say, well, but Dr. Agar, you said that by writing these methods, we could control what's passed in. And it's true, you can control it, but you have to write the code to control it. It doesn't do it magically. So what would be a good idea here? Like, what kind of numbers do you not want them to give you? Is there a certain range that you want them to give you? Anything greater than 0 maybe is okay. So let's go back inside this set height method. Is there a way we can modify this code so that it only updates the height, height equals what they passed in, when what they passed in is greater than 0? She said, can you write an if statement inside the method? Yes. So take out of your mind at this point that we're working inside a method, because technically you've been writing inside a method this whole semester. Did I just blow your mind a little bit? So there's nothing new and scary about this. Let's just say, pretend we're not inside this method. Let's say we have a double variable named ht, and we only want to set height to ht if what? If my height is greater than 0, right? This is kind of my English algorithm for what I want to happen. So how do we write that? If ht is greater than 0, set my height. Now, I see some people like, put the curly braces in, right? So I've told you guys that it's good practice to put curly braces in, right? Anytime you're writing an if statement. But remember, the rule is if there's only a single if statement, we could leave them out and it would work, right? Any subsequent lines of code I would write down here would not belong to that if statement. But this works fine with or without curly braces. Yes, if you're writing the program, make sure you put them in there just to be safe, right? But you should also know, if you look at my code, that this works without curly braces. Is cool? You could have an else here to set it to a default value. You could have an else that maybe prints out system.out.println invalid height, right? And then maybe even give them what that height was that was invalid, right? So again, if you just kind of get out of your mind that, oh no, I'm in a method, you can do everything inside that method that you could write normally inside your main method. You guys with me so far? Okay, now, is it starting to make sense why I like methods and why I like private attributes a little bit more than your textbook? So take about 5 minutes. See if you can do the same thing with width in your code. I want a mutator and an accessor, right? And probably a similar statement inside here. You probably don't want a negative width.
So I would pause the video and take a few minutes to write your accessor and mutator method for width, and then we'll get back together. So first up we have our set width mutator, which accepts a double. It sets our width variable to that double if that variable is greater than 0. Otherwise, we're going to print an error message. Then we have our accessor method, which returns a double, and we just have return width here.
Okay, and the only thing I didn't do was go ahead and set this to private. Did you guys make sure to go back up and do that? Okay, so setting everything to private, that way outside of this class I can't directly access my width variable. We as the programmers get to control how that variable is accessed. With me? Okay, now I had a question a minute ago, and I think that this is a good question to kind of talk to the whole class about. And so the question was something along the lines of, why are we writing 2 different methods? Why can't we just write this all in one method, right? Like set and get height, right? It sets it and then returns it. Could you write a method that did that? Sure, right? You could write it, you could call it set and get height. It could accept a parameter here from the user and also return that value. But the reason that we're doing this, remember, Java is object-oriented programming, right? That's one of those kind of keywords we threw out in the beginning of the semester. I always like to think of methods as buttons that people can push. They want this one little thing to happen over and over again, right? They might create 50 rectangle objects. Maybe they're making a layout of your house, right? Like a floor plan. And so they want to create all these different rectangles, and they want to set the height for all of these, right? Then later, maybe when they're calculating, different values, they want to get or retrieve that height out of them, right? So they might want to do those 2 things at separate times. So we're writing reusable code. Over and over again, people can call, hey, set my width, and it's going to happen over and over again, and then the same thing with getting the width. With me? I always like to think about like video games and stuff because we know that those are written with a lot of programs. But if you think about any kind of video game, think about Mario, right? Every time he jumps, that's a jump method that's being called, Mario.jump. Luigi can also jump, right? But it's calling that same method over and over again. If the button B is pushed, I don't remember what the buttons were on the old school remote, and Mario has some kind of fire superpower, remember that? Then he can spit fire, right? Can you kind of start to see how this code is written a little bit inside your head? Okay, so that's where we should be at this point. I do want to expand this a little bit more. We said that the rectangle class would probably have a area and a perimeter, right? So these should probably be of what type? Int, string. Let's do a double. We already have height and width as a double. So when we multiply, do math, we'll probably want to store the result as a double. So we're going to make a double area and a double, perimeter. Cool? Now, I wrote these without making them private, right? But we know now that it would be a good practice to make these attributes private. So I'm going to go ahead and make them private. Yes? Now, I want to talk about something theoretical with you. So, area. We could have a set and a get method, an accessor and a mutator method for area, right? It would work the same way as height and width. You could copy and paste that code and modify it a little bit so that it was set and get area, right? But do we want to allow our users, let's think about, you're writing a software, right, that does some math for people. They can tell you the height and width of their rectangle. Do we want to allow them to set the area? They can make mistakes, right? Here's my height, it's 3. Here's my width, it's 3. Here's my area, it's 700, right? That doesn't make any sense. So sometimes we want to control and not allow users to set certain things. So not every variable has to have a set and a get method, an accessor and a mutator. So would it make sense that someone was able to get the area's value back? Sure, they could say rectangle1.getArea, like give me what that area is. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write a get method. So public double get area. This is just like get width and get height. And in this method, I'm going to return the area. So let's go ahead and write the set area method as we're used to writing accessor or mutator methods, right? So public void set area. Usually we allow them to accept something from the user, so specifying the area. And then we'd say something like area equals whatever they passed in. So I'm back in this tester class. I'm going to set my height to 3. I'm going to set my width, rectangle1 dot set width to 3. Will these actually set the height and width with these values? Yes, if we wrote our code right, it should, right? And then I'm going to rectangle1 dot set area to 12. Is this correct? Is the area of this rectangle 12? How do you get area? Do you remember that basic formula? Just 3 times 3 would be the area, right? The height times the width. So the area should be 9, but we're setting it to 12. And then I'm going to say system.out.println height plus rectangle1.getHeight. Then I'm going to have a print line statement. I'm going to just copy this. Width, rectangle1.getWidth. And then area, rectangle1.getArea. Now we know if we run this, it's going to print out height's 3, width's 3, area's 12, right?
So here in the rectangle class, I don't want them to provide a value for me to set the area. I want to calculate the area using the height and width that I already have. So how can we update the code to do this?
One way, but how should we change this? Yeah.
Instead of setting area to the value passed in, we can just set area to the height times the width and calculate that ourselves. Now, because we did that, we no longer want to accept user input, so we will want to delete the argument double up here.
So now, I've broken this code over here because I'm trying to pass in a parameter where it's not expecting one, right? So in order to fix this code, what do? Just remove that, right? So I'm calling the set area method. So now if I run it, you can see my height, width, and area are all used correctly. Okay, so we're not allowing them to tell us the area anymore, so why are they going to call the set area method? This is going to come down to a preference of programming. At this point, so I want to go back and remind you guys that this code does not run. So that means that this piece right here will never execute unless this method is called somewhere, right? So again, the difference between the method definition and the method call. So the method has to be called somewhere. So we can either make the user push the button, set the area, right? Here's my height, here's my width, set the area. Or we can call it ourselves somewhere else. Right now, we don't have enough pieces in our code to do that, but we certainly could. So here's my question. I wrote out some print line statements to nicely print out my height, get the height, width, and area, right? But if I were to create another rectangle object, here I'm going to have rectangle rect2 equals new rectangle, right? And rect2 dot set height, I'm going to set it to 4. Rect2 dot set width to 4. And rect2 dot set area, no parameters. If I wanted to now print out the height, width, and area of both rectangle 1 and rectangle 2, what do I need to do in this code? You guys are telling me to copy paste this, right? And then change all these to rect2. Yeah? And if I wanted 50 rectangles, can you see what's going to happen? You're going to be copying and pasting that code over and over again, right? Is there a better way to do this? What? Let's write a method. I'm going to go into my rectangle class, and I want to write a method to print out height, width, and area. Now, we already have the actual statements written pretty much for what we want to print out. But first, let's focus on what does that method header look like. First question, do we want someone in a different class to be able to call it? Yeah, the whole point is we want them to be able to use it over here, right? So are we going to, what's that word we're going to use so that they can see it? Public. Now, I know we already knew that word was going to be there, but hopefully now we're understanding why. Yeah? Okay. Do we want it to return anything back to the code over here? Well, we'll come back to that. I don't know if we want to return anything or not. We'll fill that blank in a second. No, this is not correct syntax. Yes, it's going to be mad at me until I fill it in. What do we want to name it? We can name it whatever we want, right? Print rectangle is a good name. Sure. Print info, you guys have written before, right? There's not a wrong choice here. Just make sure it makes sense. Do we need anything in our parameters? Do we need them to give us any information? No, we have all the information stored up here that we want to print, right? So then what am I going to do inside this method? You're saying move that over, copy and paste that code, right? So if I go just copy and paste this code, I copied it verbatim. What's wrong with it? Okay, so rectangle 1 doesn't exist, right? So how do I fix it? Do I just delete this? Like this? Probably the way you would have done this if we didn't do it in the other program and copy it over, you probably would have just said plus height, right? Plus width, plus area. Both of these ways are valid. So this is something we actually have not looked at yet, which is where I'm calling a method inside another method. So I'm in the print rectangle method, and in here, I call get width. Now we've actually been doing that the whole time because here we're calling a method inside a method. So it's no different, right? But both of these work. This is the way you probably would write it if you were writing this yourself. But I wanted to show you that both ways are valid. So in this one, it prints out the word width, calls the get width method. So it goes up here to get width. This returns the width, right? So this is literally the exact same thing as saying plus width. I'm going to leave it like this, where it does it both ways, just to show you that it does it both ways. Okay, now I want to come back to the return statement. Do I need to have something here that says return something to the user? So if we're not putting a return statement, what is this? The print line thing gets a little confusing because we are printing to the screen, so you might start thinking, oh, it's a string, right? We're giving a string. but we're not giving it back to the person who called it. With me? So if you're confused about that, sometimes it helps to kind of leave that, write what you want the method to do, and then ask the question, does it make sense to return something? Now, go back to your original code and call this method, print rectangle, for rectangle 1 and rectangle 2. So I'm going to get rid of that. Cool. And then for rectangle 2 dot print rectangle. Now notice if you didn't capitalize your R in rectangle, then you need to not capitalize it here, right? So whatever you named that method, and this kind of goes back to if I had named this method bubblegum, not a good name for a method. It doesn't describe what it does, right? But it's a valid method name, and I would just want to make sure that I would call it bubblegum here too, right? So again, you can name these whatever you want. That bugs me, so I'm fixing it to a name that makes sense, like print rectangle again. But I do want to show you that there's nothing magical about those names that you're picking. So at home, I would probably do a similar thing for a get set perimeter method, right? And then add perimeter to the print method so that it prints that out also, right? So like actually adding the print line method to print that out. Here's what I want to do in class since we're here. I want to write a constructor with you guys real quick. So just like we saw that this code was getting repetitive to print things, sometimes code can be repetitive to set all my variables. Setting height, setting width, that can get repetitive. If I were to have 50 rectangles, you can see where that's a lot of code, right? So overloading this rectangle constructor can be helpful. Now, I'm not going to ask you to write a constructor on your exam, but I do want you to understand what it's doing so that if I have a constructor in there, like I've had in your assignments, you understand it. So we're going to do it really quick. Again, a constructor is just a special method, so it looks exactly like a normal method declaration. It uses the word public so that you can access it outside the class, right? But it does not have a return type. So we just call it public, whatever the name is of our class. Now in this case, the name is rectangle. With me? Now, this is where you get to make decisions, right? Because you can decide how you want to control creating these rectangle objects. Maybe you don't want anyone to pass in any information, and you want all rectangles to originally have a height of 1, a width of 1, and then you can set the area yourself. See how that worked? I called the set area method myself inside this method. With me? So this could be an option. This option means that all rectangles have default values of 1. And then the only way people can change that is by going through here and setting the height and setting the width. With me? But maybe you want to give them an easier way to get values into height and width without having to call those methods every time. So then I can create something like this. It looks the exact same, right? So actually, you guys can just copy and paste this constructor if you've already written it. The same constructor, but now instead of all of them having a default value, you want the user to specify the height and width when that object's created. Okay, now the way that we're going to have them specify it, anytime we want to get information from the user, just like we did with set height, right? We want them to give us information when they call the constructor. So I'm going to accept a double height and a double width, like this. With me? Now, how do I change the code inside here so that I'm not setting everything to 1? And then this set area method calls my own method that I created down here, which is going to multiply the height and width and store that in area. You with me? Yes? Okay, so now if I go over into this class and created a third rectangle, I can say something like rectangle rect3 equals new rectangle. If I want to skip, rectangle, if I want to skip the set height, set width for rectangle 3, then I can pass in the parameters right now at creation, right here. See me? So let's set it to 5, right? So the height's 5, the width is 5. And down here, I'm going to say rectangle3.print rectangle to make sure it worked. I can't spell rectangle today. And you can see here that the height is 5, width is 5, area is 25. So it worked. Here would be my suggestions for you. I would work with this perimeter attribute, create those methods. I would also create, and I'm going to type this in here, I would create a isSquare method that's going to return true or false if the rectangle is a square. Is there going to be an if statement inside there probably? Yeah? What type do you think it's going to return? It's going to return true or false. So over here, I want to be able to say something like system.out.println rectangle3.isSquare. This is what I want it to eventually look like. Right now, there's not a method, but I want this to work, and I want it to tell me whether or not it's a square. Yeah? Okay. That's just good practice for you to put these skills to use at home.
That's it for today. Happy coding.